Do you have Mr. Chomsky on the line?
Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Chomsky.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Doing fine.
Listen, how should I address you? Professor Chomsky, Mr. Chomsky, Noam, whatever?
Noam is fine.
All right. Thank you very much, Noam. I appreciate you being on the show this morning. It is quite an honor to have you on. And I'll tell you, when I was doing research, I didn't even know where to start because you've written so much that it covers such a wide variety of topics. Obviously, if you're studying language and foreign policy, that's going to encompass almost everything. But I wanted to make a couple comments about some of the people we've had on the show just recently and some of the statements they've made, and I'm going to be paraphrasing these people. One of them is somebody that you mentioned in the most recent book that you and David Barsamian have collaborated in, the Propaganda in the Public Mind. Dean Baker of the Center for Economic Policy and Research said that the Clinton-Bush corporate model of globalization is not about free trade, and I would even add that Bush is constantly being compared to the Reagan free trade market-based economy. Are any of these people or interests really about free trade?
Well, Dean Baker knows what he's talking about, and I take him very seriously. He's a first-rate economist. It's a mixture, this sort of what's called neoliberal globalization. If you take a close look at it, it's a complicated mixture of liberalization, free trade and protectionism, high protectionism, with all sorts of, modified and finessed in all kinds of ways to ensure that major concentrations of private power, unaccountable private power, gain dominance over domestic policy and international policy. Now, there are elements of free trade in it, but there are also many other elements. So, for example, I'm sure Dean Baker talked about this, but the so-called TRIPS system, intellectual protection of intellectual property, that's a highly protectionist system without historical precedent that was imposed on the rest of the world by the rich countries in what came to be the World Trade Organization. It imposes extremely rigid conditions on control over the technology and knowledge of the future, the conditions that today's rich countries like the United States never accepted while they were developing, but are now being imposed on the rest. Well, that's super protectionism. Or just, for example, there's something called a national security exemption, which allows government expenditures. Well, in the United States, and most other industrial countries, but it's extreme here. For the last 50 years, national defense is just a kind of a Orwellian term referring to massive public subsidies to cover the risk and cost of the development of new advanced technology. That's nothing about free trade there. We wouldn't have what's called the new economy if it wasn't for the way in which costs and risks were essentially socialized. The public pays for them. That's another violation. And there's all sorts of other gimmickry. On the other hand, there's and some of what's called free trade doesn't really have anything to do with trade. For example, the conditions on financial liberalization. One of the things that the system of the past 20, 25 years has done is eliminate earlier constraints that governments could impose on capital flow, meaning flight of capital, modalities of investment, and so on. Well, that's eliminated, but movement of capital is not trade. And what's coming up is even more extreme. One of the major issues coming up, it's kind of being negotiated pretty quietly because I don't think they want people to understand the consequences of it. But right now there's current negotiations on what's called trade and services going on in Geneva. This was a big issue at Quebec also at the last April. The new so-called free trade area of the Americas is supposed to have strong elements of liberalization of trade and services. Well, what are services? Services covers just about anything that might be in the public arena. So education, health, control over water, environmental conditions, you name it, anything that might be subject subject to public involvement, what they call governments, which means people to the extent that governments are democratic. Anything that might be under popular decision-making and control, that pretty much covers what services are. Liberalization of services, which has nothing to do with trade, means let's work out ways for those things to be taken over by private power concentrations, by multinational corporations, which are unaccountable to the public, work in secret, are essentially tyrannies internally, and let's do that claiming that we're liberalizing trade. This is simply a way of undermining democracy. It has nothing to do with trade. So I suspect Dean Baker probably talked about all these things, but those are some of the aspects of what's called free trade. I mean, Adam Smith certainly wouldn't have recognized it. In fact, if you go back to classical free trade doctrine, say Adam Smith, it was based crucially on what Smith called the free distribution of labor, meaning labor can go anywhere. Well, that was to some extent true in the 19th century when there were massive population movements across borders, but certainly not true now. People can't go, capital can go anywhere, but people can't. That's almost the opposite of classical free trade theory. For Adam Smith and David Ricardo and so on, it was taken for classical economics. It was assumed that capital is immobile and people are mobile. That's what the whole theory of comparative advantage and everything else is based on. And the benefits of free trade are based on those assumptions. Well, now the facts are almost the opposite. Capital is mobile, labor is immobile. That fact alone gives major advantages to capital in conflicts between concentrated private power and the mass of the population. The working people shifts the balance. And this is all sort of imposed under the rubric of free trade, which sounds like a nice word, but is often it's become a highly intricate concept, which is simply a form of class warfare, basically.
Also, in the newest book, Propaganda in the Public Mind, you state that it's always, you commend people for asking the obvious questions, and so I'll be asking obvious questions this morning and hopefully get a commendation from you. One of the things that I've heard people who are neoliberal, or maybe even a better term for it is conservative, or whatever label, those are so nebulous, I really don't even know what those words mean anymore, is that at the critics and protesters of, for instance, the free trade area of the Americas, or the WTO hearings, or ministerial hearings, or whatever globalization agreement hearings that are going on, they always say that, business has to be represented because these are about business and trade, and those people know the best about what to do with business and trade, and the people should be represented, and the people are represented by their elected officials. So having protesters and critics say that it is not a democracy because, in fact, the people are being represented by our U.S. trade representative annuls the fact that that it is not a democratic process. How would you respond to that?
Well, why don't you kind of take a poll in the streets of Chicago and ask how many people know who the U.S. trade representative is, or one thing that the trade representative is committed to. These are negotiations. These are policies undertaken in secret. The negotiations are essentially in secret. The results are secretive. They're among trade ministers of governments. That's true. But the relation between the trade ministers and the population, the executive branch and the population, certainly doesn't even begin to resemble democracy. In fact, and it's well understood. I mean, for example, the Wall Street Journal a while back was lamenting the fact that it's hard to pass these procedures that insulate trade agreements from popular pressure. It gets very hard to pass them because the public doesn't like them. And they said the problem is that opponents of these measures have what they called an ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon is that the population is opposed. So therefore you have to somehow do it in secret behind their backs, since naturally we have to do it. When you say that the governments, the United States is about as democratic as any society around. On the other hand, about 75%, first take say the last election, roughly 75% of the population before the election, not after the Florida shenanigans, but right on the eve of the election, about three-quarters of the population felt that the election had nothing to do with them. It was some kind of game being played by rich investors, rich contributors, political leaders, the public relations industry, which was crafting candidates to come out with words that they thought might appeal to people, and so on. Now, if three-quarters of the population thinks an election isn't even going on, what are we talking about when we say that the negotiations being carried out in secret by people who no one ever heard of represent the public will? Business isn't misled about that. They know that the public is an ultimate weapon, in the Wall Street Journal terms, against what they're carrying out, which is exactly why it has to be done in secret. So, for example, at the Summit of the Americas last April was a good example. The Quebec meetings. It was discussing the free trade area of the Americas. How much discussion had there been in public, say in the press, about what the free trade area of the Americas is, and how many people even knew that it existed? This has been under negotiation for years, but it's kept out of the public eye. People can discover something about it if they really work. You get involved in the activist networks, and you interchange over the internet and so on. Yeah, you can figure out something about what's going on. You listen to Dean Baker and people like that. You can find out what's going on, but that's a minuscule part of the population. That's not freedom and democracy. And even at the meetings, while the leaders of the governments came out with a ringing statement about how wonderful democracy is, you can tell how much they meant it by asking what happened there. For example, if they're so committed to democracy, how come they're not telling us what the negotiations on trade and services are about, a core issue? Why aren't they telling us if it's democracy? Or to take something even more straightforward, at those meetings last April, right timed just to appear with, you recall that George Bush, every time he talked, was talking about how wonderful NAFTA is, right, and we have to extend the marvels of NAFTA to the rest of the hemisphere. Well, right at that time, every news desk in the country had on it two major reports that had come out by very respectable and well-known organizations. One is Human Rights Watch, major human rights organization. The other, the Economic Policy Institute, a research institution in Washington that does some of the basic work on the data of what's going on in the country, the economic data. They had two major reports, both about NAFTA, both timed for the onset of the meetings. Human Rights Watch, filling its mandate, was concerned with rights, labor rights. What's been the effect of NAFTA on labor rights? They gave a detailed report showing convincingly, I think, that in all three countries, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, labor rights had been harmed by the NAFTA agreements. And they gave many examples. The Economic Policy Institute had three major studies, one by specialists on Mexico, United States, and Canada, indicating that, which gave plenty of evidence, that in all three countries, the large majority of the population had been harmed, mostly in Mexico, where it's quite serious. Well, okay, maybe you can argue about whether the results are right or not, but what's interesting is they weren't discussed. There was virtually no mention of them at the meeting, and as far as I could find, virtually no mention in the press. Well, people ought to know. If this is a democratic process, then the population of the three countries ought to be very well informed about the fact that two major organizations, investigative organizations, have looked into President Bush's claims in considerable detail and have presented information information saying it's exactly the opposite. That wasn't reported. All that was reported was, isn't it wonderful, NAFTA's helping everybody. We can go on, but all of this is an indication not only that it's not a democratic process, but that power centers are deeply committed to prevent it from being a democratic process. And the reason is they know the public is opposed. Not everybody, of course, but a substantial part, probably a majority of the public is opposed, and that's worldwide. So therefore you have to do it in secret. When people say business ought to be represented, it's not very clear what that means. I mean, does business get represented twice, both because they're people and because they're business? That's okay. Then why not have other organizations represented? Why not have unions represented? Why not have environmental groups represented? I mean, business is not like an entity opposed to the population. It's just people in a particular position in the population. They have no special representation.
Yeah, we're speaking with Noam Chomsky. This is Hell every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. You are listening to WNUR 89.3 FM. A couple of things I've heard on different news sources this week, in the last couple of weeks, really irked me, especially in light of doing my research on you. I saw Ray Suarez the other day on the Lehrer Report. He was discussing what is going on in East Timor right now. And East Timor, in case the audience does not know, held their first free elections this week. Yet in all the articles, you see happy, smiling people in the pictures, and you hear really great news of finally having free elections, and there was no word about U.S. complicity by both Republican and Democratic administrations within their horrible human rights offenses that were going on in the country by the Indonesian military. And Ray Suarez said that the East Timor, or the Cambodian, he was saying that it was 25 years since the Cambodian killing fields. He said that was easily the worst genocidal practice that has happened since World War II.
Which was Cambodia, or
Cambodia was?
Well, it was quite comparable to East Timor. Relative to population, East Timor probably was higher, and it was at the same time. I mean, the atrocities the Pol Pot atrocities took place from April 1975 to January 1979, when the Vietnamese put a stop to them by kicking Pol Pot out of the country. The East Timorese atrocities, the major ones, the ones that led to the destruction of maybe a third or a quarter of the population, they took place in exactly the same years. The East Timorese ones continued. They continued through the 80s. They continued again. They were horrifying in 1999. Throughout it's hard to compare atrocities. They're all different in all kind of ways, but they were certainly comparable. Furthermore, the Indonesian ones were not only crimes against humanity, but also war crimes. This was outright aggression, vicious outright aggression, condemned by the United Nations, but the United States acted. Our own ambassador, Daniel Moynihan, made it very clear and explained with pride that he had, on State Department orders, rendered the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do to stop the atrocities, which he was well aware of. The major difference between these two cases is that in one case, you could attribute it to an official enemy, at least if you didn't pay attention to what was happening before and after, where the U.S. was very deeply involved in atrocities. But if you just limit it to, April 1975 to January 1979, you can pretend that it was just some enemy who was doing it, so therefore a great outrage. In the case of East Timor, comparable in those years and then becoming much worse later, you can't say that. It was the U.S. that was primarily responsible by providing the arms, by providing diplomatic support, by suppressing the facts here, which was done. It's a media contribution. And that continued, and then the Britain got in. By 1978, at the peak of the massacres, Britain got heavily involved in implementing them. That went on right through September 1999. I mean, at a time after the vote, when the Indonesian army went on a real rampage and kicked maybe 85% 85% of the population out of their homes and destroyed about maybe 70% of the country. After that, the official U.S. position was, I'm quoting it, it's the responsibility of the Indonesians, and we don't want to take it away from them. So not a move to try to stop it. About a week later, under enormous international pressure and domestic pressure, Clinton was compelled to shift his policy. He made some gestures indicating to the Indonesian generals that they should call it off. Within 48 hours, they were out. That indicates the latent power that was always there, and it indicates very clearly where the responsibility lies for everything that happened, quite apart from the fact that the U.S. was providing, along with Britain, the arms and training and diplomatic support and so on. So yeah, these things are different. In one case, if you narrow your sight sufficiently, you can attribute it to an enemy. In the other case, you got to look into the mirror. That's the main difference. Other than that, they're quite comparable atrocities.
Also, another thing I saw on the news, this was on Sunday morning's Fox News Sunday. Luckily, I do not get the Fox News channel, but the Fox News Sunday, the comparable show to Meet the Press, Face the Nation, whatever, at the same time slot on Sunday mornings. They had a roundtable, and there was somebody from the Washington Post. I can't remember all the people who were involved, but one of them was Juan Williams of National Public Radio's Talk of the Nation, and he said that his sister had just come back from Switzerland, and that she said, how do you feel about being an American? It's kind of embarrassing being in Europe because of our unwillingness to support the Kyoto Protocol, to sign on to the treaty for germ warfare, and especially what happened in the Florida election. And Juan Williams then said, I couldn't take it, and I just said, you just got to get over it. You just got to move on. And the host of Fox News Sunday actually did like a slapping motion, as if he was punishing this woman for even saying this. What do you think about somebody who is trying to tell us that we should forget about things that actually just happened?
And are going on. And as far as the Kyoto Protocol and the germ warfare treaty and the militarization of space and other things, not only are they going on, there's a reasonable probability that those things will lead to destruction of human life. We're not talking about minor things. I think I didn't hear the comment, and don't like to talk about individuals when I haven't heard them.
Right.
But anyone who says that, let's make it abstract. What they're doing is living up to a kind of a major principle of life, unfortunately, which is don't look into the mirror. Look at somebody else's faults, but don't look at your own. You can find nice comments about this in the Gospels if you want. And unfortunately, there is such it's very easy, it's very convenient to say, look, I'm only going to look at what the other guy did that was wrong. I'm never going to look at myself. I'm not going to look at the mirror and ask what I'm responsible for, because then that raises, hard questions. It's much easier to talk about how rotten the other guy is. We're all familiar with this, and it's a profoundly immoral position. And in the case of an extremely powerful country like ours, and people who are like us, who are therefore very influential in the fate of the world, it's not only immoral; it's criminal.
How do you feel about I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to word this. How do you feel about the logic of voting with your dollar? By being a smarter consumer, we can undermine the odious actions of corporations simply by boycotting them. Or and like you've said on many occasions, that the media is about selling to advertisers. It's not about the audience. Yet if you talk to somebody who is within that medium, and of course they've already bought into the value system of that medium, they would say that, well, the only way that we can sell advertising is if the audience is there, and we have this democratic mechanism of the Nielsen ratings that tell us if the audience is there. So how would you react to those types of consumer statements, that the Nielsens are a democratic system, and that voting with your dollars is an appropriate way to act as a consumer within a capitalist democracy?
Voting with your dollars is an interesting form of democracy. Democracy means each person has an equal participation in decision making. That's democracy. Are dollars equally distributed? Voting with dollars is it's kind of like arguing that the Soviet Union under Stalin was democratic. Plenty of people could participate, but in different ways. If you were in the Communist Party hierarchy, you had a form of authority that you didn't have if you were somebody in the streets, even though they could make their opinion expressed too. Voting with your dollars is a radical attack on democracy. As far as the Nielsen ratings are concerned, what is being measured is the way people are choosing under a highly structured set of choices, which are given to them by major corporate institutions, which have their own agendas and commitments quite naturally. Don't blame the major corporation for trying to advance its own interests. It'd be crazy if it didn't. But that's not choices. For example, there's very little doubt that, I think the Wall Street Journal is quite correct, and other business press, in recognizing, and in fact polls show us this, that the public is quite concerned and very strongly opposed to government decisions on many issues, like, for example, the so-called trade agreements. So people would, I'm sure, like very much to know what's going on at the FTA, what's being planned for them. But they don't get that choice. That choice is not one that's available. There was no choice available as to whether you wanted to hear what the careful reports were saying about the effects of NAFTA. People care about that. And polls show very clearly that people care about it, as do demonstrations and so on. But they're not being given that option. This is controlled options within which you're allowed to make, it's like it's like what's called a democratic election in totalitarian states where you can pick one or another of two, party hacks. It's not exactly like that, but that's what it's about. Incidentally, this idea of voting with your dollars is really worth thinking about. It's true that mythology is talked about, and it's supposed to be a wonderful thing. We're supposed to be what are called, in Chicago, you should know all about this. It's where it comes from. We're supposed to be rational wealth maximizers. Each individual is supposed to be trying to maximize his or her own wealth and to use their dollars in the marketplace to do that. Well, let's go back to the Kyoto Protocols. From that point of view, if you accept that ideology, Chicago ideology, then it's entirely reasonable to destroy the environment. In fact, it's a worthwhile thing. And the reason is quite simple. There are individuals who don't have any dollars to vote with in the market, like your grandchildren. Your grandchildren, who may not be alive, don't have dollars to vote in the market. Therefore, if we are rational wealth maximizers, we to destroy the possibility for them to have a viable existence in order to maximize the number of shoes we have. In fact, that almost follows logically from the ideology we're supposed to worship. Now, it is rational, but within a system, an institutional and ideological system that's totally lunatic and entirely, horrendously opposed to ordinary human values. Those are things we should be concerned about. You say the same about militarization of space. What's masked under missile defense, because defense sounds nicer than offense. But if you get away from the Orwellian deception, what's called missile defense is a very minor component of a major move towards militarization of space to ensure extending the arms race into space, where the U.S. is way in the lead, creating offensive weapons, massive systems of destruction that can be used for global dominance. The administration, and this runs through administrations, like the major documents we have are from the Clinton administration, high-level documents, are saying, look, we got to do this for the same reason that Britain had a navy, to control the commerce and investment opportunities of the British all through the world. We need to control space for that, and we have to have offensive military capacity to ensure that we can immediately destroy anyone who gets in the way. What they talk about is pretty amazing. That makes sense, too, if you don't care about the question of whether the world will survive in another generation. These policies raise significantly the chances of what are called in the literature normal accidents. any complicated system is going to have unpredictable accidents. Anybody who has a computer knows that. Every once in a while something goes wrong for some unpredictable reason. And when you get really complicated systems, it happens all the time. So there's a technical concept called normal accidents. When you get something like hair trigger command and control systems that are going to launch laser-like death rays if they think something's going wrong, like some other country shooting off an anti-satellite weapon, you're making it highly likely that normal accidents will appear. Those normal accidents are not like your computer crashing. They're like the world going up in smoke. But it makes perfect sense to accept that possibility if it leads to short-term gain. Short-term gain both in profit and in power and global control. So the policies of self-destruction have a kind of rationality. I once wrote an article about 20 years ago when the whole Star Wars lunacy was going on called The Rationality of Collective Suicide. And the point of it was to say, yes, within a framework of lunatic institutional and ideological commitments, within that framework, it is rational to carry out actions which may well lead to collective suicide. Well, that ought to raise, I think that's true, and it's even more true now, and it ought to raise serious questions about the institutions and the ideology.
It always disturbs me when I hear people say that they are doing something for the children, and then they don't think about actually the children's children or the future in any way. What they are doing is trying to hide behind their children's cloaks in a way. We're speaking with Noam Chomsky. Noam, I only have a couple more questions for you, but our producer, Kevin Harris, has a really quick question for you. Kevin?
Yeah, I know.
Hi.
I was listening to a lecture on Z Magazine Online from Danny Schechter, and he was talking about, in reference to a lot of what you have been saying about how, a lot of people come up and say, like, is it a conspiracy? Is this a bunch of people acting in conjunction and all the way down through the institutions? And the point that he made, that, of course, that you make, is that you're not going to get, and I wish you could elaborate on this, get to a certain position in these institutions without having a certain frame of mind. In other words, it weeds out anybody that would question the institution in the first place.
Yeah, that's true, and I think most of us know this in our own personal lives. I mean, how do you make it? Like people like us got the good colleges, okay, got what's called a good education. Just think back. How'd we do it? I mean, did we do it by telling the fourth grade teacher or the high school teacher that we thought what they were telling us was perfect nonsense, even when we knew it was? No, we got it by being obedient. From the very beginning, you're trained to be what's called, not a troublemaker. Be obedient. Do what you're told. Don't make a fuss about things. Just kind of go along. And the people who don't do that are identified. They become behavioral problems or something or other, and they get weeded out. Those of us who are capable of being, even if we don't like it, of saying, okay, I'll be obedient and go along and get to the next stage. We get ahead. I'm talking about myself. Could have easily told the high school teacher you're talking a lot of nonsense in the history class, but I didn't do it. I just did the stupid work we were assigned and got ahead. And finally, that kind of gets ingrained. First of all, there's a kind of a selection for obedience, and then after a while, it just gets ingrained. I mean, it's very difficult to do one thing and believe something else. So you go on doing it, you end up believing it, and slowly, subtly over the years, there's a selection for. Or maybe even honest acceptance of the ideology. People just say, yeah, I think that's right. It's okay, they'll get ahead. There's a whole complicated selectional process, and I really think most people are aware of it from their own lives, if they look back honestly, which leads to the conclusion that the people in high places are those who accept the framework. I mean, if I remember reading things by, the what are called the left-wing critics of, say, the New York Times, Tom Wicker and Anthony Lewis, who say, very outraged, nobody tells me what to write. And they're absolutely correct. The critics are not saying that anyone tells them what to write. What they're saying is you wouldn't be in a position to write if you hadn't already internalized the ideology. Otherwise, you'd be driving a taxi cab. And that goes on right through a professional life. And people teaching in universities are familiar with it, and in other institutions. You go along, or you tend to get in trouble. Now, it's not like a mechanical system. So there are kind of ways of finessing it and getting through and so on and so forth. But it's a tendency. It's a strong tendency, and it has its effects. In corporations, even more so. These are, after all, tyrannical systems. You have to obey. But over time, it has its effects. The institutions, furthermore, have their own structure. They have their own. Like if suppose you're the CEO of a big corporation, you don't have the choice of being a decent human being. It's not your choice. I mean, here I agree with Milton Friedman. Your responsibility, in fact, your legal responsibility, is to maximize profit and market share for the benefit of the stockholders. That's your responsibility. It's not your responsibility to see that workers have decent conditions or that the environment doesn't get destroyed. If you spend your time and effort on that, you're not going to be CEO very long. Somebody will kick you out. It's an institutional fact that the person in that position has to act like a moral monster. It's not an individual, it's not a critique of the individual. It's of the institution again, like the things we were talking about before. Well, all of this ends up in a system in which certain kinds of things are overwhelmingly likely to happen. Not because people sit in the Bilderberg conference and decide to do it that way. Of course, that's not what goes on. But for deep-seated institutional reasons that that permeate much of the society and that are heightened and sharpened in essentially tyrannical institutions like corporations, which have by now enormous power, linked to one another, tied to powerful states, extremely influential in setting the framework within even the most democratic states have to function. That's and the media are just part of that, of course. So that leads to consequences which can be ameliorated, and they should be ameliorated. But the long-term solution is not to ameliorate them. I mean, you could ameliorate slavery too. You make it less onerous. The problem is to get rid of it.
As you've said, unless you internalize the values of America being a superior nation, having a superior government, even a benevolent government, as you were just saying, you end up being a taxi cab driver, or you might end up like me, being a bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show host who isn't
right.
getting paid.
I should say that internal to the institutions, like the media. I mean, like I have personal friends in the media, way high up, some of the best-known people. I won't mention names, who are much more cynical about them than I am, but they see it from the inside. And they try to create a space for themselves where they can do certain things and kind of get away with it. And have all kind of techniques for doing it. Very self-consciously. This includes some of the best investigative reporters, for example.
I have two questions for you. One question is the question from hell, which is how we finish every interview. We're speaking with Noam Chomsky. We always try to ask a difficult question or a question that is just kind of, silly maybe. But I had another question before, and I just don't think that you could do this in a brief amount of time, and I don't want to ask you to lessen the value of such an important question. But we've had people on like Dunstan Bruce from Chumbawamba, Penny Rimbaud from a band called Crass. We've had Chucko on from this this anarchist internet clearinghouse called infoshop.org, and every one of them seems to have an opinion, or actually a definition of what anarchy is that seems to be completely opposite of what you either hear the media saying or maybe even some trendy poser saying, who believe that all anarchy is about complete destruction, absolutely no organization whatsoever, and everybody just doing what they want to do and not working together whatsoever. Is there any way that you could define anarchy in a brief period of time, or is that just too important of a question?
Well, first of all, nobody owns the word, so you can say it is whatever you feel it is. But if you take a look at the anarchist tradition, it's a very rich tradition. deeply rooted in the American tradition, I should say, in life and practice more than in ideology. But if you take a look back at the anarchist tradition, the way it's been implemented and formulated and so on, almost everybody is committed to a highly organized society, but a society that's organized from below. That is, it's based on popular participation at every level, voluntary association, interactions among associations, federal arrangements, workers' control in factories, community control in communities, interactions between the two. In fact, very elaborate proposals have been made about anarchist organization in the rich tradition. If you ask what it's all about, let's put it in a phrase. I mean, as I say, people can look at it differently, but what it's always meant to me, and I think this is like the core of the tradition that goes way back, is a commitment to question authority. If you discover an authoritarian relation, a relationship of control and domination anywhere, family life, international society, wherever it is, if you discover such a relation, challenge it. Ask if it's legitimate. It's not self-legitimizing. Any relation of power and authority has to justify itself. If it can't, it ought to be dismantled. Now, sometimes such relations can be justified. Like if I'm taking a walk with my, 4-year-old granddaughter in the street, and she runs out in traffic, and I grab her arm and pull her back, that's an authoritarian relation, but I think I can justify it. And there are many others that in particular circumstances, you can give a justification for it. But the point is, it's the burden of proof is on the person who exercises the authority. And most of the time they can't do it. The major problem in social change, this has to do with, whether you're talking about slavery or women's rights or, political freedom or anything else. I mean, the major problem is what's called raising consciousness. That is recognizing that you are in a position of subordination and domination, that you're the victim of subordination and domination. That's not easy to do. You tend to kind of like accept the world the way it is. And even to perceive that there is a domination that ought to be questioned, that's a very hard move, and the major move in social change and revolution over history right to the present. Once you can get to that level of consciousness, then you ask, well, it's the responsibility of those exercising the authority to justify themselves. If they can't do it, it's illegitimate. It's illegitimate. We ought to work to dismantle it and set up a more free and participatory society. There's no end to this process. It's kind of an ongoing process, kind of like mountain climbing. You climb, you see a peak, and you think, okay, I'll work hard and get there. When you're there, all of a sudden you notice there's another higher peak farther beyond. Okay, more consciousness raising. And I presume that's, human life insofar as it's decent. It's going to go on that way. So anarchism, as I see it, is kind of like a tendency in human affairs, seeking to create more freedom, more justice, undermine more, discover illegitimate authority, which is hard, challenge it, and find ways to undermine it.
And you may have answered this question within that question, but this is the question from hell for Noam Chomsky. First of all, I want to thank you for being on the show. But I've found that anarchists, and from doing this show, not from beforehand, I'd always had a different impression of anarchists, but I found from doing this show that anarchists are very optimistic people. I had the impression that they were very pessimistic, that they thought that the world was in a horrible disarray and that we needed to destroy everything and rebuild it. But in fact, from doing this show, I found that anarchists are very optimistic people who believe the populace wants democracy, wants self-rule, wants community rule, wants neighborhoods to get together and be part of a community. Yet here in the United States, only half the people vote. Most support monopolies. When I go to, my friends, are very anti, for instance, Microsoft. But if I go to a bar and, I open my mind and realize that just my friends aren't, my circle of friends are not the whole entire world, it seems to me that most people do not vote. They have no interest in voting or in politics. Most support monopolies like Microsoft. And that communities, neighbors are kind of pitted against each other in a sense that people are isolated from each other, either by self leisure from watching television or whatever. They don't interact. My neighbors, I don't even live in that transient of a neighborhood, and a lot of people just won't even say hello to you on the street. So what makes you think that people here in the United States, what makes you think that people here in the United States really want democracy?
Not voting can just be interpreted in many ways, and I think the right way to interpret it, and I think public opinion studies which have been carried out in depth support this, is that the reason people don't vote is because they don't think there's an election going on. I mentioned something earlier, which is just one piece of a major Harvard University project called the Alienated Voter Project, trying to figure out why people don't vote. And it shows quite consistently that they just don't think there's any choices. They don't see much point in choosing between two representatives of the corporate world who you can't understand, and because they're crafted by public relations officers to come out with words that they don't mean and they probably don't understand themselves. If that's what you think is happening, which is not unrealistic, then a lot of people won't even bother. And it's interesting. You take a closer look. Take the last election again. It's pretty typical. The people who did vote, around half, probably the majority, voted against their own interests, and consciously so. So when people are asked about issues, which candidate do you prefer on issues? And then you run through a bunch of issues. Most of the time, they can't figure out where the candidates stand on issues, and it's not because they're stupid. I mean, anybody who watched the debates knows, you really don't know what they're talking about half, and nor do they half the time. But to the extent that people could identify issues, by rather large majorities, they preferred Gore, or to put it more accurately, they disliked Bush more. I didn't like either of them, but they disliked Bush more on issues. On the other hand, the vote was kind of a statistical tie, which means that people didn't vote on issues. They voted on what in the public relations literature is called qualities. You're supposed to, in fact, they try to design the election so that if you vote at all, you vote on the question of, is this the kind of guy I'd like to meet in a bar? Or is this the kind of guy I hated in fourth grade because he was know-it-all? What's called qualities, but not issues. You want to keep issues out of the election. Like for the population in the last election, one of the top issues was actually the trade deficit, because people know what that means. That translates into their jobs and their lives and so on. Major issues were these trade agreements. They didn't even come up in the election. No, they weren't discussed. The way in which the elections are run, which is a kind of it's a narrow competition between various sectors of private power, and people know that. You just don't bring in issues on which you know that the public, the ultimate weapon in the Wall Street Journal's terms, they're going to be opposed. So you just don't raise those issues. Raise issues of, this guy kind of look friendly, or, would you like to meet him, or something like that. So the failure to vote is, from this point of view, which I think is an accurate one, is not opposition to democracy. It's commitment to democracy and seeing that it's not going on.
That's an interesting analysis of it, but what would you say about people who support monopolies?
Take me. I happen to be sitting in front of a computer right now. On the computer is a screen, something I was writing when you called. Well, that happens to be using Windows. It's not because I like Microsoft. In fact, I hate Microsoft, and I hate the program and thing. But I'm using Windows because I don't have a choice.
But there are people who would be for, I'll be sitting in a bar, and a guy will say, hey, listen, Bill Gates was smart enough to come up with this. Shouldn't he be rewarded for, even, I know that's completely inaccurate, but there's a feeling that you should be rewarded with all of the booty if you actually are the person who own the company, and you should be able to overwhelm a market, and that's okay because that's the American way.
Well, then we have a number of questions have to be asked. First of all, is it the American way? And if it is the American way, is it the right way? Was something the right way in Russia in 1953 because it was the Russian way? Obviously not. Furthermore, the assumption is just wrong. Bill Gates didn't come up with the idea. In fact, Gates himself has said honestly, that his great genius is being able to take the ideas of others and turn them into a way to make money. The people who came up with the ideas, though they are maybe unaware of it, are U.S. taxpayers. The thing that I'm sitting in front of, this computer with that, this fancy computer with that complicated software on it, that was mostly it came out of a public initiative. It was developed. You take a look at the history of the computer industry. It was developed in the 1950s and the 1960s primarily under the rubric of the military. Like my wife, for example, back in the 1950s was a programmer in a what's called secret project. Everybody knew exactly what it was. That was working on what was called air defense. They weren't working on air defense, and everybody knew it. I mean, they were working on a program that maybe with luck could have stopped a World War I bomber piloted by Snoopy or something like that. What they were actually doing was working out the basic design of modern computer. In those days, a computer was some huge thing with a whole bunch of rooms blowing up all the time because it had vacuum tubes, and so on. They were trying to work it down to a point where it could be, usable and sellable. When that happened, the director of the project pulled off and founded one of the first mainframe producers. I mean, the reason IBM isn't producing typewriters is because they were getting huge contracts from the public under the framework of the Defense Department, the military, to improve the design and operation of computers. When it finally got down to the point where they became marketable, then it was handed over to private corporations, and people like Bill Gates could go run with it. The same is true of a good part of modern technology. Actually, I don't know if Dean Baker, you mentioned, talked about this, but one of the very important studies that he did had to do with the pharmaceutical industry. Now, the pharmaceutical industry claims that they need these terrifically high profits because of all the innovation and research and so on that they carry out. If they don't get the profits, we won't get new drugs. Well, Dean Baker, good economist, asked a simple question. How much of the R&D, the research and development, are the companies actually paying for? Well, turns out that the public is, through public expenditures, is paying a very substantial share, probably somewhere in the 40 or 50% range of R&D. Furthermore, that's a serious underestimate because the part that the public is paying for is what's fundamental to the new developments. A large part of what the corporations are paying for is, Me Too drugs. Somebody else has one, I'll make one like it, or frills around the edge. If you did an honest analysis, you'd probably find that a considerable majority of the funding is just coming out of the public purse. So Baker raised the obvious question. Suppose we raised the public contribution to 100%. I'll say they roughly double it, so even be less than that. Okay, that eliminates, and then make the companies sell them on the market. Without the production, we're supposed to love markets. Fine, let them sell their drugs on the market. Without the huge protection that comes from these highly protectionist patent regimes that have been imposed on the world. And he calculated that there would be an enormous reduction in costs, and the savings would simply be overwhelming. I mean, they would swamp by orders of magnitude, the total savings anticipated by the most optimistic predictions of the trade agreements. And then that would eliminate the argument that, well, we need the profits because of R&D. Well, that's not a popular proposal, though it makes perfectly good sense. But that gets back to who had the bright idea. The bright idea usually comes out of the public, very commonly comes out of the public purse. I mean, it's not that the guy you met in the bar figured out how to design a computer, but it's his tax dollars that did.
Right. Well, thank you very much for being on this morning's show, Noam. I really appreciate it. I've got so many notes here. I could interview you for another 6 hours, and I really hope that I get the opportunity to do this again. It's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate you coming on our show.
Glad to be with you.
All right. Thank you, Noam.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.